Hi, in this video we're going to talk about default values, and in particular we're going to talk about an issue that can come up. So first, let's see what happens at runtime when a module is loaded. So when a module is loaded, now it can happen in different ways. Maybe you're importing the module from another module. At that point the module is being loaded, if it's the first time you're importing it. Or maybe it's your main module that you're calling from the command line, right? Or whatever the case may be. There's different ways modules can be loaded. But when they do, all the code in the module is executed right away. And what do I mean by code being executed? Well, you have things like, for example, a equals 10. That's pretty obvious, right? We're executing a equals 10. We're essentially creating the object, the integer object 10, and then we're assigning a to that object, right? We're letting a reference that object. But when you have this type of code here, def func a, and then some code inside, well, that actually is also being executed. Now, it's not the function being executed. What's being executed here is def, which is something that creates the function. So it's going to create the function, it's going to put it in memory, right? And then func, you can think of as simply just a variable name that happens to point to that function object in memory. So this actually is being executed, not in the way that happens when we call func a. That is executing the function. This line here is still being run, it's still being executed as code, but it's not running the function, it's just defining the function. And so by the time we reach func a, the function has been defined. And every time we call func a, it's going to look at that particular object that func is pointing to and execute that function. So what about default values? Well, let's look at that again. So we have def func a equals 10. So now we have a default value, right? We've got a single positional parameter that has a default value of 10. Now def is going to run, it's going to be executed, it's going to create the function, just as before, and func is going to be essentially the variable name of the function. It's going to be the name that references that object. But also what happens is that the default value is being evaluated and created as an object, and the default for a is then referencing that object in memory. So that object, once def has run, this object 10 now exists, right? It is an object, and the default for a points to that object. Again, the function itself actually is not run, it's just being defined, it's being created. Now when we call func, what happens? Well, now we execute the function. But the function is this object that's being already created in memory. And amongst other things is that the default has already been created. It's not being recreated or re-evaluated every time we call the function, right? That determination and that evaluation and creation of the default value is done once when def runs, not when func is called. So Bob here is saying, well, so what? Big deal, you know? Well, it is a big deal in certain circumstances, because consider this. Let's say that we want to create a function that's going to log a message to the console, but we want to provide a keyword-only argument that's going to be optional for the date and time. So the caller can specify the message and the date and time at which they want to essentially tag that message. But we want it to be optional. So if they don't define the date and time, then we want the function to fill in the current date and time. So we might try something like this. First we're going to import datetime from the datetime module. That will allow us now to set the default for DT, right? So we have a log function with a message and a DT, a keyword only argument, since we've got the style there, that is going to have a default value of now, right? Of datetime.utc now, the current UTC date and time. And then we'll print the message, but we'll print the date followed by the message. So if the user provides a date, that will get printed here. If they don't, we'll grab the current time and print that out. That's what we're trying to achieve. But let's see what happens in reality. If we call log message 1 at some point in time, we'll get some timestamp and our message, right? This just happens to be the time at which I ran this code, for example. And let's say that, the module takes a little while to run, or maybe there's something else happens, there's a pause or whatever the case is, but let's say that sometime later, right, maybe a few minutes later or a few seconds later, we call this log function again. So we call log message2. And here's the output we get. Now you'll notice that the date and time is identical down to the, dot, the milli and microseconds. It's identical. And that's obviously not what we wanted. So what's going on? Why is this identical? Why is UTC now the same? It can't be. We've had elapsed time between the two. Well, the reason for that, remember, is this datetime.utc now is an object that gets created and put into memory and is assigned as the default for DT. But it is done when def runs, not when the function is called, which means that DT stays the same. It stays that same object, right? And so that's why it doesn't matter how many times you call the log function, the date and time will remain the same. Obviously, that's not what we want, right? We want the date and time to reflect the current date and time at the time when the log function was called. Now, there might be cases when you want this to be the case, right? But that's different. That's not what we're trying to do here. So here's a solution, and this is kind of a pattern that you can use for any kind of problem like that. We're not going to set DT to that defaulted time, right? Instead, we're going to set it to none. And when we set it to none, we can then test inside the function to see if it's still none. By setting it to none, by saying DT equals none in the parameters, we're essentially still making it an optional argument, right? Because it has a default value. The default value just happens to be this none object. So if the user passes a value for DT, it will not be none anymore. If they don't, it will be none, and we'll know that, well, the user didn't pass a value in. So now inside the function, we can test to see if the user actually passed that argument in or not. And if they didn't, then we can set it to the current date and time. But we do that inside the function because that gets run every time the function is called. So we might do something like this. So we'll def log message, we'll put the star in again, and now we have our keyword only argument, DT, and we set its default to none. And inside the function, we're going to test if DT is, now I'm using this OR Boolean operator. Recall from the previous lectures that when we have A or B, if A is truthy, it will return A. Otherwise, it returns B. Well, when is DT going to be truthy? If it has a value. In other words, if the user specified a value. So if they did, we'll just use the value. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and grab the current UTC date and time. So this line of code is equivalent to just writing it this way. If not DT, in other words, if DT is falsy, then set DT equal to the current date and time. And then we can just print out DT and message. So this will fix the problem. This will do exactly what we want it to do. Now, in general, always beware of using mutable objects or callables for defaults in your parameters. Just be careful with that because you can run into issues. So just think about it. If you're going to make DT equal to, let's say, a list, right? Or you're going to make DT equal to a function call, be careful. Realize that it's not going to get called again. So if it's a function that is supposed to change over time, that won't happen. On the other hand, if you set DT equal to some other list, let's say you have a list that's assigned a variable name somewhere, and you set DT equal to my list, well, be careful, because now you might think, oh, it's never going to change because def only runs once. Well, that's true, but now the default is pointing to an object that's mutable in memory, which means it can change. Potentially it can change, and so now it's no longer constant, right? It's no longer going to be just this one-time thing that never changes. So it works both ways. You can have problems either way. So just be careful with that. Be aware of those kinds of problems. All right, so let's switch to some code and let's just try all this out and see how it works. All right, so let's first start by importing datetime from the datetime module. So from datetime, import datetime. And we are now going to call datetime.utc now. I just want to show you what that does. That basically just returns the current date and time. And if you want to see it printed nicely, so this is an object, right? But it also has a string representation. There we go. That's the string representation. Now I can execute this a number of times, and you'll notice that it changes, right? Its time is moving along. So here we have 05, 06, 48, 52, etc. Okay? So time is moving along. Now let's go ahead and try and write this log function that we talked about. So here's the first approach we might take. So we're going to ask the user for a positional parameter, which is going to be the message. And then we want an optional date and time. And if they don't specify the date and time, we want to take the current date and time. So we'll set it to datetime.utc-now. Okay. And then we're just going to print out the date and time and then the message. So we'll do that. And we'll print the date time first and then the message. Okay, so there's our function. So we can call log and we can pass in a message. Let's call it message1, and I'll pass in an actual date and time. So now I have to pass it as a keyword only argument, and maybe I'll say it's 2001 01 01 00 00 00.00, whatever. Okay, some date. And so when we run that, we get that. Now if I was to change the date to something else, maybe I'll make that 2010, and we get that as well. So all that works perfectly fine. Now let's go ahead and not specify the date and time, and let's see what happens. So let's call this message2, and so we get the current date and time, which happens to be the current date and time. As you can see, it's close to the ones we were getting here. Okay, so I'm talking just to wait a little bit, and now I'm going to log another message. Let's call it message3. And as you can see, no time has elapsed, right? The date and time is still the same, and it doesn't matter how many times I call this, it will still remain the same, right? And the reason for that is, as we discussed in the lecture, is that this datetime.utc-now is evaluated when def is run. At this point here, the function wasn't executed, the function was created, and the default value was also created at that time. So it will never change throughout the lifetime of this. Now, if I rerun somehow, if I reload the module, or I'm able to rerun the definition of the log function, and I can do this by hitting Shift-Enter here, I just reran it, right? You can see that my in number has changed to 14. It used to be 7 or 8, I don't remember. But now, of course, if I run this log message, well, now I've got a different date and time. But if I run it again, I now have still the same one. It keeps coming back. Okay, so hopefully that illustrates what's happening. So we need to fix that. And a common pattern to solve that is to use a default value of none. So we're going to redefine our log function. So the same way as before, but instead of setting dt to the function call, we're going to set it to none. And then inside the function, we're going to test if it's still none. Now in this case here, when I actually specify the date and time, well, dt will not be none anymore. So basically, if as a caller, I pass in the dt argument's value, then that means that dt won't be none. So that's all I need to test for, right? So I could say if dt is none, then dt is equal to, so I could say, you know, if dt is none, so if dt is falsy, then I could set dt equals datetime.utc-now. Okay, so that would work. And let's go ahead and then print whatever we were printing before. I'm just going to copy paste it. Okay, and so now if we call log message1, and if we pass in a date, then it will work as before. I'll just pass it this way, sorry. Of course, it's a keyword only argument. Okay, so there we sorry, if not dt, right? If dt is falsy, we want to set the default date and time. So there we go, right? And now if we call log without specifying dt, if I can type, then we get, you know, the default, the current time now, because dt is none. I didn't specify it when I called this function. So dt is none. It took on its default value. So therefore, it's going to go ahead and run this. And if I run it again, so I'm talking a little bit, there we go, right? We've had a change in the timestamp. So that's working as we expected. Now, there is a better way, or maybe not a better way, but certainly a more concise way of doing this, and that's by using the fact that the OR, Boolean OR operator, works in the sense that if A or B, if A is truthy, return A, otherwise return B. So we're just going to say dt is equal to dt or datetime.utc now. And this way, right? So if dt is none, it's going to be falsy. So if it's falsy, it's then going to return B. If it's truthy, which means I specified a value, it's not none, then it will do that. Now this means, by the way, that if, and either case would have worked the same way, if I was to do this log message 3, and I do specify dt, but I make it equal to none, for example, right? It's still going to work correctly. It's still going to say, yeah, okay, you didn't specify something other than none in here. So that's one way of fixing the problem. I also want to very quickly talk about the other thing I was talking about in the lecture, which is, let's say we have a function, let's say def, let's call it func, that takes in, let's say, a value a, and I'm going to make it equal to a list. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to create my list equals 1, 2, 3. And here I'm going to make the default be my list, and then I'll just print a. Okay? So now if I call func, well, it's just going to print my list, because that's the default. If I call func with a different list, let's say a and b, then it's going to print a and b. But now look at what happens here. Let's say I do my list dot append, and let's say I append a value to it. Okay? So now my list is what? My list is 1, 2, 3, 4. And if I call func, what do I get? Well, I get 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So this is now the opposite problem, where let's say here I expected that a will always default to 1, 2, 3, but something went ahead and changed that list, right? Because my list is just a pointer, right? It's a reference to wherever this object lives in memory. So when I change that object in memory, because it's a mutable object, then I have this problem. So if you want to make sure that it doesn't happen, then what you really would prefer to do is use a tuple. Then you know that that can't change, right? Because you can't append to a tuple. So now when I call my list, it's still 1, 2, 3, and the function will still default to 1, 2, 3. So again, just be aware of those problems that you can have with default values. Basically, it's just the fact that when Python encounters this, right, this line of code here is fully evaluated and is kind of set. But it's also set in a way that it references objects for the defaults. So if you're referencing a mutable object, you can have a problem. If you are instead calling a function that you expect to change over time, as we did right in the beginning, then again, you can run into issues. And this is actually a fairly common error, right? That's easy to make. So don't fall into that trap. All right, I think that's it. That's all I have to say for default values and some of the caveats associated with them. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.